The wind last night felt sharp enough to slice through skin, the kind of winter storm that turns every breath into ice. I was walking home from my late shift at the diner when I noticed an elderly woman sitting alone beneath the dim awning of a closed hardware store. Snow piled around her boots, and her thin coat clung to her as if it were made of paper. People hurried past without pausing their heads down against the bitter cold, and for a moment I nearly did the same. But then she lifted her eyes and looked at me. There was something in that look, a quiet plea wrapped in exhaustion. I stepped toward her and asked if she was all right. Her voice trembled too much to answer. Without thinking twice, I removed my warm coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. I gave her the hot sandwich I had packed for the walk home and helped her stand, feeling how light and frail she was beneath the layers of wet fabric. I guided her to a small storage shed beside the store where the wind could not reach her. Before I left, she whispered through chattering teeth, "You were the only one who stopped." Those words weighed on me as I hurried away. I already knew I was late for the dinner. Ethan had insisted I could not miss a dinner that was supposed to be my first chance to meet someone important in his life. I pushed through the storm as fast as I could, but the snowfall was too heavy to fight. By the time I reached home, I was exhausted and ashamed of how late I had become. The next morning, the rumble of engines outside my apartment pulled me from sleep. I looked out the window and froze. A line of black SUVs filled the street. Ethan stepped out first, followed by an older man in an immaculate suit. And then the elderly woman from the storm appeared beside them, transformed and elegant. Ethan looked at me with a shaken expression and said, "Lena, meet my mother." I had saved the widow of a billionaire without even knowing it. Before we continue, I would love to know where you are watching this story from. Every time I share a moment from my life, I am amazed by how many people from different places and backgrounds come together to listen. It reminds me that kindness, no matter how small, can connect strangers across the world. Have you ever helped someone in a moment when it felt like fate placed you in the right place at the right time? Share your experience in the comments. I read every single one, and your stories matter here. If you enjoy emotional and meaningful stories like this one, make sure to follow the channel so you never miss a new episode. Your support helps me continue telling the kinds of stories that bring warmth, hope, and connection to people everywhere. I never imagined my life would cross paths with wealth or power in any meaningful way, because nothing about my world suggested I would ever step into that kind of reality. I grew up in a small town where people worked long hours, counted every dollar, and helped each other without hesitation. After graduating high school, I found comfort in the familiar rhythm of the local diner where I worked as a waitress. The diner was nothing glamorous, just a modest little place with worn booths, bright lights, and regular customers who ordered the same meals every day. But it felt like home to me. I knew every face, every favorite dish, and every quiet story hidden behind tired eyes. That was the kind of life I understood. That was where I met Ethan Ward. He walked in one cold morning in late November, ordered black coffee and toast, and thanked me with a soft smile that caught my attention before I even realized it. He became a regular within weeks, always sitting at the same corner booth with his laptop open, tapping away at something he never fully explained. I assumed he worked in IT or maybe graphic design because he had the thoughtful look of someone who spent a lot of time inside his own head. He would ask about my day, listen closely, and offer simple but sincere compliments that made me feel seen in a way I was not used to. Over time, our conversations grew longer, our laughter easier, and before I knew it, we were spending time together outside the diner. No fancy restaurants or expensive gifts, just long walks, takeout dinners, and nights spent talking until neither of us could keep our eyes open. I thought I understood exactly who Ethan was. Kind, humble, gentle, and grounded in the same simple life that shaped me. He never bragged, never hinted at privilege, and never made me feel like I was less than him. So when he asked me to be his girlfriend, I said yes without hesitation. A year later, when he knelt on the small wooden bridge behind the diner and held out a modest ring that sparkled like a small piece of hope, I said yes again. I loved him, I trusted him, and I believed every word he ever told me. The only thing that ever gave me pause was the way he reacted whenever I asked about his family. He always grew a little tense, offering vague explanations that his family was complicated, or that his mother valued privacy more than anything else. I assumed it meant they lived far away or simply did not approve of his life choices. I never pressed him further because I knew what it felt like to carry parts of your life you were not ready to share. I thought we had all the time in the world to slowly open those doors together. What I did not know was that Ethan was hiding a truth far bigger than I could have imagined. There were small signs, subtle moments that should have made me question things sooner, the tailored clothes he never explained. The expensive watch he claimed was a passed-down family heirloom, the way he paid cash without ever looking at the bill. I brushed it all aside because love makes you believe the simplest explanation, and I believed Ethan was exactly who he presented himself to be. When he finally told me about the dinner, he seemed more anxious than I had ever seen him. He said it was time for me to meet someone in his family, someone whose approval mattered more than anyone else in his life. He never explained why, only that the dinner was important, that his mother expected punctuality, and that I had to look presentable. His hands trembled when he gave me the simple guidelines he said I needed to follow. I remember laughing softly and telling him he was overreacting. I did not understand why he was so afraid, or why he insisted I could not be late under any circumstances. Even then, I had no idea I was walking toward a world that had been carefully hidden from me. I had no idea the truth would come crashing down in a way that would expose everything he had kept inside and everything I had never seen coming. The night Ethan finally told me the truth began with a silence so heavy it made my chest tighten. We were sitting on my small couch after dinner, the kind of quiet meal we usually enjoyed without any pressure. But something about him felt different. His hands kept fidgeting with the edge of a napkin, and his eyes shifted away every time I tried to meet them. I asked if everything was all right, expecting him to brush it off like he always did, but instead, he exhaled slowly, as if preparing himself for something painful. He said there was something he had been hiding from me, something he should have told me much earlier but had been afraid to. I waited confused until he finally said the words that would change my entire understanding of who he was. He told me his father had been Victor Ward, a billionaire who built a massive investment empire before his unexpected death. He told me his mother, Eleanor Ward, had inherited most of the estate and controlled the Ward Foundation, one of the most powerful philanthropic organizations in the country. I stared at him, unable to speak, because nothing about the Ethan I knew matched the life he was describing. He explained that he had spent most of his adulthood trying to escape the pressure and expectations that came from being part of the Ward family. He said the wealth had never brought him peace, only scrutiny and endless comparisons to his father. He had left that world to build a life where he could be himself, where no one treated him differently because of his last name. That was why he never told me why he came to the diner looking like a regular customer instead of someone who grew up in mansions and traveled the world before he turned 20. He said he wanted to be loved for who he was, not for the money tied to his family. I could tell it hurt him to admit all of this, especially because he feared the truth would make me see him differently. I told him I needed a moment to process it, but before I could even begin to understand what it meant, he continued speaking this time with a trembling urgency. He said his mother had insisted on meeting me, not asked, but demanded. He said Eleanor valued appearances and status above almost anything else, and that meeting her was not something anyone simply showed up to without preparation. He handed me a small folded paper, and when I opened it, I realized it was a list of rules. Not suggestions, not gentle guidelines, but strict expectations written in his neat handwriting. I felt my throat tighten as he explained each one. Do not talk about your childhood unless asked, because his mother believed people of influence should surround themselves with others who came from similar privilege. Do not mention your job at the diner, because Eleanor had made it clear in the past that she disliked the idea of her children marrying someone from a service background. Do not bring up charity or social causes, especially homelessness, because she saw those conversations as emotional distractions unbecoming of formal introductions. And whatever happened, you must not arrive late. Eleanor considered punctuality an indicator of intelligence and discipline, and she had a reputation for cutting ties with anyone who disrespected her time. Ethan spoke faster and faster, as if trying to convince himself as much as he was trying to convince me. He said he knew the rules were unfair and outdated, but following them would make things easier. He said if I could just follow them for one dinner, everything might turn out fine. I stared at him, stunned, hurt, and overwhelmed. The man I had believed lived a simple life was now telling me he came from unimaginable wealth, and instead of celebrating his honesty, I felt like I had been pushed into a different world without warning. A world where my memories of growing up in hand-me-down clothes and sharing meals with neighbors would be considered flaws. A world where my job, something I took pride in, was a source of embarrassment. Ethan reached for my hand and told me he loved me, that he wanted a future with me, but that winning his mother's approval mattered more than I realized. He said we could build a life on our own terms later, but this dinner was the first step. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust that this was simply an uncomfortable moment we had to face together. But deep down, a knot formed in my stomach, a quiet warning that everything was about to change. The night of the blizzard arrived with a fury I had not seen in years, a kind of storm that erased the world in white and swallowed all sound except the roar of the wind. I left the diner later than usual because one of the cooks had called in sick, and I agreed to stay and help close up. The moment I stepped outside, the cold hit me with a force that stole my breath. Snow was pouring down in heavy sheets, drifting across the parking lot and clinging to my hair and eyelashes. My scarf did little to shield my face, and every step felt like wading through wet cement. I pulled my coat tighter and kept my head down, knowing I had only a short walk before reaching the bus stop where I would ride halfway home. My goal was simple: get home, sleep, wake up early, and spend all day preparing for the dinner that might determine the future of my relationship. But life has a way of turning simple plans into choices that define who we are. I had barely made it a block from the diner when I saw something that made my steps slow. At first, it looked like a pile of discarded clothes slumped against the brick wall of a closed hardware store. But as I moved closer, I realized it was a woman. An elderly woman curled in on herself as if trying to disappear into the shadows to escape the brutal wind. Her hair was silver and tangled, her coat torn in two places, and her gloveless hands were pressed tightly against her chest. Tiny clouds of breath puffed into the air in uneven patterns, and her shoulders shook with an uncontrollable tremor. I stopped, torn between instinct and fear. I had been warned for years to be careful walking alone at night, especially during storms that kept most people off the streets. But the fear that flickered through me was quickly drowned out by something else. Something that came from deep inside my chest, a familiar pull that reminded me of the way my mother used to stop and help anyone who looked like they needed even the smallest kindness. I approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Ma'am, are you all right?" I called out, though the wind carried half my words away. Her head lifted an inch, just enough for me to see her eyes, which were watery and red from the cold. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her lips were pale, and her face held a look of exhaustion that went beyond physical discomfort. It was the kind of exhaustion that comes from being overlooked too many times by too many people. I felt something twist inside my chest. I knelt down beside her despite the snow soaking through my jeans. "Can you stand?" I asked gently, but her movements were weak and disoriented. Without thinking, I took off my thick winter coat and placed it around her thin shoulders. The cold bit instantly into my sweater, but the relief on her face made the sting worth it. I helped her sit up straighter, lifting her carefully as she leaned heavily against me. She whispered something that sounded like "thank you," but her voice was barely more than a breath. I reached into my bag and pulled out the warm sandwich I had packed earlier. It was supposed to be my dinner on the way home, but in that moment, it felt wrong to keep it. She needed it more than I did. I unwrapped it and pushed it into her hands, guiding her fingers around the bread because they were shaking too hard to hold anything steady. She took a bite so slowly it broke my heart. Snowflakes clung to her eyelashes like tiny crystals, and her breathing remained shallow. I knew enough about cold exposure to understand she could not stay where she was. She needed shelter, warmth, and medical attention if things got worse. I pulled out my phone with numb fingers and called the emergency hotline the city listed for extreme weather. A recorded message answered first, stating that response times were delayed due to the severity of the storm. Eventually, a tired-sounding dispatcher picked up and told me all available units were stretched thin. They could not guarantee anyone would reach our location soon. The dispatcher asked if I had a safe place to bring her temporarily. I looked around. Most businesses were closed, and the few lights I saw belonged to locked offices or shuttered storefronts. But then I remembered the small storage shed behind the hardware store a place workers often used during breaks. It was not warm, but it would keep the wind off her until help arrived. I slipped my arm around her and helped her rise to her feet. She leaned on me with all her weight, and for a moment I feared we would both fall. The snow continued to fall harder, but I focused on putting one foot in front of the other, coaxing her to do the same. We reached the shed after a slow struggle, and I pushed the door open with my shoulder. The interior was dusty and dark, filled with old shelves and unused cardboard boxes, but it was out of the wind, and that was all we needed. I settled her onto a stack of blankets piled on top of a crate, then rubbed her hands between mine to warm them. She watched me with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief, as if she could not understand why someone was helping her after so many others had walked by. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked in the cold air. "You are a good soul, child. The world needs more of you." Her words hit me with unexpected force. I felt tears sting my eyes, but I blinked them away, telling her that someone was on the way and that she was not alone. I checked my phone again. 20 minutes had passed since my call, and there was still no update. The storm was growing fiercer, and the flakes whipped through the open cracks in the shed like needles. I wanted to stay with her until help arrived, but another thought pressed in on me, sharp and urgent. I was late. Not just a little late, but unforgivably late for the dinner Ethan had insisted was of life-changing importance. His last words echoed in my mind, the warnings about punctuality, the fear on his face when he spoke about his mother. Panic twisted through me. I stood there torn between two worlds, one where a fragile woman needed me, and another where the man I loved was waiting with expectations I had promised to meet. My heart felt pulled apart in opposite directions. I looked at the woman again, saw the trust in her weary eyes, and something inside me made the choice for me. She had no one else. She had been left alone in a storm that could have taken her life. I could not join the crowd that overlooked her. I promised her I would return soon and stay until help arrived. I wrapped my scarf around her neck before leaving, hoping it would bring her even a small amount of warmth. As I stepped back into the blizzard, the wind screamed so loudly it drowned my thoughts. I fought through knee-deep snow, shivering so hard my teeth hurt. Each step toward home felt heavier than the last, weighted by fear and guilt and uncertainty about the consequences waiting for me. By the time I reached my apartment, my fingers were stiff, my hair frozen in strands across my cheeks, and remorse pressed down on me like a physical weight. I knew Ethan would be furious. I knew I had failed the expectations he had been so desperate for me to meet. But as I stood in the doorway, struggling to catch my breath, another realization settled quietly into my heart. I might have ruined a dinner, but I had helped someone survive the night. And some choices, even the costly ones, are worth making. When I finally reached my apartment building, the storm had quieted enough for the streetlights to glow through the thinning snowfall, but my body felt as if it had been carved from ice. My fingers were numb, my clothes soaked, and every muscle ached from fighting the wind. I climbed the stairs as quickly as my trembling legs would allow, rehearsing in my mind how I would explain everything to Ethan. I knew I had kept him waiting far longer than I should have, and dread curled in my stomach at the thought of disappointing him on a night he believed could shape the rest of our future. When I pushed open my apartment door, I found him standing in the middle of the living room. He turned at the sound of the door, and the look on his face made my breath catch. His hair was disheveled, his coat still on, and he looked as though he had been pacing for hours. His expression twisted from relief to disbelief to anger in the span of a heartbeat. "Where were you, Lena?" he demanded, his voice raw with worry and frustration. I opened my mouth to answer, but the words tangled in my throat as I took in the storm brewing in his eyes. I tried to explain, telling him about the woman in the blizzard, how she had been freezing and helpless, and how no one else had stopped. I told him I could not simply walk by and pretend I did not see her suffering. But instead of softening, his expression hardened. "You stayed with a stranger," he said slowly, as if trying to understand something impossible. "You stayed with a stranger when you knew how important tonight was." His voice rose, the anger he had been trying to suppress finally spilling over. "Do you have any idea what this means? Lena, you were supposed to meet my mother tonight and you did not show up. Not late. You did not show up at all." I felt the air leave my lungs. I tried to tell him again that I had called for help, that the storm had made everything worse, that I had not expected to lose so much time, but my explanations sounded weak even to my own ears, drowned beneath the memory of the promise I had made to him about being on time. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, turning away from me as if he could not bear to look at me. My mother already had doubts, he said, his voice quieter but full of strain. "She does not approve easily. Tonight was our chance to show her that we are serious, that you are serious, and you did not come." The disappointment in his words struck deeper than his anger. I had never heard him speak to me that way. I took a step toward him, shivering as the cold from outside continued to cling to me. Ethan, she would have died out there. I could not leave her. I know this dinner was important, but so was she. She was freezing and alone. What kind of person would I be if I just walked by? Ethan turned back to me, eyes glistening with a pain I did not understand. "This is not about what kind of person you are. I know you are good. I know your heart is always in the right place, but sometimes being good is not enough. Sometimes you have to be smart too. Sometimes you have to choose what will matter in the long run." I stared at him, stunned. The long run. That was his concern. Not the freezing woman. Not the possibility that she could have died without someone stopping. For a moment, the storm outside felt quieter than the one raging inside my chest. He stepped closer, lowering his voice as if trying to regain control. "My mother sees punctuality as respect. You arriving on time tonight was the most important first impression you could have made, and instead she waited and waited and eventually called the dinner off entirely." His words felt like blows, each one landing with precise intention. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to stop the trembling that had nothing to do with the cold. "So I am supposed to regret helping her?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He closed his eyes, shaking his head. "No. You are supposed to understand how much this cost us." I stood there silently, realizing that somewhere between the man I fell in love with and the man standing in front of me, fear had taken root. Fear of his mother. Fear of losing control. Fear of not being enough in her eyes. That fear was shaping him in ways I had not seen before. And as much as I loved him, his anger cut through me, leaving a crack I did not know how to mend. For the first time since meeting him, I felt an ache of uncertainty about where we stood. The morning after our argument arrived with a gray light that seeped through my curtains, the kind of pale winter sun that brought no warmth with it. I barely slept, replaying every moment from the night before, from the storm to the woman's trembling hands to Ethan's furious expression. My body felt heavy, weighed down by the emotional wreckage left behind. I was sitting at my small kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of lukewarm coffee, when a deep rumble outside made the window vibrate. At first, I thought it was a snowplow clearing the streets, but the rumble grew louder and more rhythmic. Curiosity pushed me to stand, and when I pulled back the curtain, my breath caught in my throat. A convoy of 3 black SUVs was parked in front of my building, their engines idling, sending puffs of exhaust into the icy morning air. For a moment, I wondered if I was imagining it, if exhaustion had finally tipped into delusion. But then the back door of the lead vehicle opened and Ethan stepped out. He was dressed more formally than I had ever seen him outside of work, wearing a dark wool coat and polished shoes that glinted beneath the winter sun. He looked both anxious and resigned, as if bracing himself for something inevitable. My heart thudded painfully as I hurried to open my door, expecting him to climb the stairs. Instead, he remained on the sidewalk, turning toward the SUV as another figure emerged. The man who stepped out carried an air of authority that could not be mistaken. He was tall, sharply dressed, and moved with a confidence that suggested he was used to commanding a room simply by entering it. I recognized him instantly, even though I had only seen his face in magazines and news articles. Lawrence Pierce, the executive director of the Ward Foundation, a man known for shaping billion-dollar decisions with a single phone call. Seeing him outside my modest apartment felt like watching 2 separate worlds collide in real time. I opened the door wider, heart racing as if the cold air might carry clarity with it. Ethan finally looked up at me, his face pale, his expression tight with nerves. He motioned for me to come outside. I stepped into the hallway, then down the stairs, each movement slow and surreal. When I reached the bottom, my breath fogging in front of me, Lawrence Pierce offered a polite nod. "Miss Hart," he said in a voice smooth enough to belong on a political stage. "Thank you for coming out. We realize this is unexpected. Unexpected did not begin to describe it." I glanced at Ethan silently, begging for an explanation. He swallowed hard before speaking. "My mother wants to see you," he said softly. "She asked for you specifically." The words struck me harder than I anticipated. The woman I had stood up only 12 hours earlier, the woman Ethan feared most disappointing, now wanted to see me. I opened my mouth to respond, but the passenger door of the second SUV opened before I could form a single thought. When the woman stepped out, time seemed to fold in on itself. She wore a long wool coat, her silver hair brushed neatly back, her posture straight, despite her age. She looked dignified, refined, every inch the kind of woman I had imagined Ethan's mother to be. But what made my pulse stop was not her elegance. It was her face. I knew those eyes. I knew the curve of her cheek and the tremble in her hands as she held her coat tighter around her. It was the elderly woman from the storm, transformed but unmistakable. For a moment, the world dimmed, my mind scrambling to make sense of what I was seeing. She looked at me with recognition that softened her entire expression, and a warmth spread across her features that no amount of wealth could disguise. Ethan stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Lena, this is my mother." I could not speak. I could not even breathe properly. All I could do was stare at the woman I had sheltered in a freezing shed only hours before the same woman Ethan had warned me not to disappoint. She took a step toward me, and in that moment, my entire understanding of the night before shifted forever. The ride to the Ward estate felt like drifting through a dream I had never intended to enter. I sat in the back seat of the SUV beside Ethan while his mother Eleanor rode in the vehicle ahead of us with Lawrence Pierce. The silence between Ethan and me was thick enough to press against my ribs. He kept glancing at me as if searching for the right words, but everything he tried to say dissolved before reaching his lips. My hands rested stiffly in my lap, and I stared through the window at the passing world where snow covered every rooftop and tree branch in a pristine white that did nothing to calm my nerves. When the convoy turned onto a private road lined with towering pine trees, I felt my throat tighten. At the end of the long path stood a massive stone mansion that looked like something carved straight out of a winter painting. Its wide steps led to a set of tall doors framed by frosted glass. Warm golden light glowed from the windows, a stark contrast to the icy stillness outside. As the SUV stopped, the front door opened and staff members stepped out, forming a quiet line to welcome Eleanor home. She moved with grace, acknowledging each of them with a nod before turning to look back at me. Her gaze was unreadable, neither cold nor warm, simply observant, as though she were studying a puzzle only she knew how to solve. I forced my legs to steady themselves as Ethan and I followed her inside. The foyer was grand beyond anything I had ever seen. The ceiling soared high above us, adorned with a chandelier made of crystal that refracted the soft lighting into shimmering patterns across the marble floor. Portraits of the Ward family hung on the walls, their eyes following our movements with an intensity that made me feel as though I were trespassing in a museum of power. A butler approached and asked Eleanor if she wanted the dining room prepared. She gave a single nod, and he disappeared through a side door. She then turned to me, offering a calm smile that caught me off guard. "I am glad to see you again today," she said, her voice steady and soft. "Thank you for taking care of me last night." I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. "You looked like you needed help," I managed. "Anyone would have done the same." She studied me for a moment before answering. "You would be surprised how many people walk past someone in trouble, especially when that trouble does not fit into their world." I felt the weight of that statement, knowing it was directed not only at society, but perhaps also at her own son. Ethan shifted beside me, his discomfort clear. Eleanor gestured toward a set of double doors, and we followed her into the dining room. The table stretched nearly half the length of the room, polished to a mirror shine. Only 3 places were set, all on one end, arranged with crystal glasses and silver cutlery so precise it looked untouched by human hands. Candles flickered gently, casting golden reflections across the surface. A server appeared and poured water into our glasses before retreating silently. As we took our seats, Eleanor sat at the head, while Ethan and I sat opposite each other at her sides. I felt painfully aware of every movement I made, the way I placed my napkin on my lap, the way I held my water glass, even the way my shoulders rose and fell with each breath. Eleanor did not speak immediately. She looked between us with an expression that held both kindness and calculation, as though she were weighing the air itself. Finally, she folded her hands and spoke. "Last night was not the first time I visited that shelter," she said. "I often go without telling anyone. It helps me stay grounded, reminds me of the people we claim to serve with our foundation." She took a slow breath. "But last night something went wrong. My driver had an emergency to attend to, and I insisted on staying behind to finish my visit alone. When I left the shelter, my car would not start. My phone slipped from my pocket into the snow, and by the time I found it, it had stopped working. I attempted to walk until the cold forced me to stop and rest." Her gaze drifted to the table as if recalling the fear of that moment. "I was colder than I have ever been in my life, and I was invisible to everyone who passed by. Except you." The room seemed to grow still, even the candles quieting in their flames. I felt my eyes sting, remembering her trembling hands, the way she whispered gratitude into the storm. Eleanor looked at Ethan now, her expression sharpening. "My son has been raised in a world where schedules, image, and performance are often valued above compassion. Victor believed that discipline creates success, and in some ways, he was right. But my fear has always been that this belief would grow so strong that Ethan might forget what truly matters." Ethan lowered his gaze, his jaw tightening. "Mother, I was worried. You do not understand the pressure I was under." She lifted a hand, gently stopping him. "I understand perfectly. I have lived under those expectations longer than you have been alive. But worry does not excuse misjudgment." She then turned to me again, and her eyes softened. "While others looked away, you saw a human being in need. You gave me warmth when you had none to spare. You stayed with me when no one else would. That is character. That is the quality I value more than any background or status." My throat tightened as emotion rose inside me. I did not feel worthy of such praise, not when I had arrived drenched and late and unprepared. She continued, her tone now carrying a firmness that made Ethan straighten in his chair. "You judged her last night for her lateness without understanding her reasons. And you placed more importance on my approval than on the well-being of a stranger. That is what concerns me." Ethan swallowed, his hands clasping tightly in his lap. He looked at me with regret filling his eyes. "I am sorry, Lena. Truly. I acted out of fear, not love." I felt his sincerity, but the wound from the night before still lingered like a bruise beneath the skin. Eleanor reached for her glass and took a sip before speaking once more. "As a family, we have resources that allow us to make real change in the world, but what we lack sometimes is the ability to see beyond the walls that money builds. You did not grow up in such a world, and that is exactly why your presence has value." She paused, her voice steady. "If you choose to join this family, I will welcome you not because of your background, but because of your heart." My breath caught and tears blurred my vision. I had walked into this mansion expecting judgment, scrutiny, and rejection, but instead, I was being offered something else entirely. She looked at Ethan then, with a mother's mixture of love and disappointment. "And you, my son, must decide what kind of man you want to be. A man ruled by fear of failure, or a man shaped by the compassion of the woman beside you." The silence that followed was profound, and for the first time since entering the estate, I felt the air shift. Not away from me, but toward something new. The hours that followed our intense dinner felt quieter, not because the mansion had grown still, but because something inside me had shifted. When Eleanor excused herself for the evening, leaving Ethan and me alone in the grand hallway, I could feel the weight of everything unsaid pressing between us. The walls around us were lined with family portraits, each depicting a legacy I had never intended to step into. Yet here I was standing beneath them, with a man who suddenly looked smaller than all his inherited expectations. Ethan stood with his back against the carved banister, his shoulders slumped, his expression raw and unguarded. For a long moment he said nothing, simply studying the marble floor as though searching for the right words hidden in the stone. When he finally spoke, his voice came out low and shaken. "I failed you last night," he said. "I failed you and I failed myself." I moved closer, crossing my arms gently, not in anger, but in protection of my still tender heart. Ethan lifted his head and met my eyes, and what I saw there made me inhale sharply. He looked shattered, but not by pride, by realization. "My whole life," he continued, "I was taught that strength meant control, that success came from discipline and order and doing everything exactly right. My father believed that. My mother believes it in her own way, but last night when you chose to help that woman, you did something I have never been brave enough to do. You broke the rules for someone who needed you." I felt my throat tighten as he stepped closer, his voice trembling. "I judged you for being late. I judged you because I was terrified of disappointing my mother, terrified of repeating the mistakes my brother made, terrified that if I misstepped, everything I cared about would fall apart. But instead of protecting what mattered, I ended up hurting the person I love." The sincerity of his words washed over me, easing some of the ache I had been carrying. I reached out and touched his hand, surprised to find it trembling. "Ethan, you were scared," I said softly. "It does not excuse what happened, but it explains it." He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply as if steadying himself. When he opened them again, something in his expression had changed. The fear still lingered, but it was no longer steering him. "I do not want to be that man anymore," he said. "I do not want to let fear dictate how I treat the people I love. I want to be better. For you. For us." Hearing him say the words aloud felt like a slow, healing warmth spreading beneath my ribs. Still, I knew one apology, no matter how heartfelt, could not erase the wound entirely. Growth took time, and honesty took courage. I squeezed his hand gently and replied, "I need to know we can talk openly. I need to know you will trust me the way I trusted you, even when I did not know everything about your world." He nodded immediately, his eyes shining with a mix of determination and remorse. "You deserve that, and I want to earn back every piece of trust I damaged." Then, almost reluctantly, he asked, "Are you angry with me?" I let out a slow breath, feeling the truth settle inside me. "Yes," I said quietly, "but I still love you." His eyes softened and he reached for me like someone reaching for a lifeline. "And I love you, Lena, more than anything my family name could ever give me." His arms came around me, drawing me close, and for a moment the world outside the mansion and all its expectations seemed to fade away. It was just the two of us standing in the middle of a legacy neither of us fully understood choosing each other anyway. When we finally stepped back, I saw something new in Ethan's posture. Not the rigid confidence he wore to impress the world, but something far more important: humility and hope. He took my hands once more and whispered, "If you are willing, I want us to move forward from this together. Not the way my family expects, but the way we choose." In that moment, I felt the fracture between us begin to mend, not because everything was magically fixed, but because he was finally ready to grow beyond the fears that had shaped him. And for the first time since the storm began, I felt a quiet certainty settle inside me. We might actually have a future worth fighting for. Our wedding day arrived on a gentle spring afternoon, the kind where sunlight felt soft instead of harsh, and the breeze carried the faint scent of blooming flowers. We decided not to marry in a grand ballroom or a cathedral filled with gold accents, even though Ethan's family had offered more extravagant options than I could count. Instead, we chose my parents' backyard, a modest patch of grass bordered by lilac bushes and the tall oak tree where I used to read as a child. White folding chairs dotted the lawn, and strings of warm lights hung overhead like glowing pathways in the early dusk. It felt peaceful. It felt real. It felt like us. When I walked down the aisle, Ethan's eyes glistened with the kind of emotion that made my breath catch. Gone was the rigid tension he once carried, replaced by a sincerity that reached every part of his expression. He looked at me as though stepping into this life together was not a duty or an expectation, but a choice he was proud to make. Standing near the front was Eleanor, dressed in a graceful navy gown that shimmered subtly under the lights. She held something in her hands folded carefully, almost reverently. When I reached the altar and Ethan took my hand, she stepped forward and smiled at me with a warmth that had grown steadily since that night in the blizzard. "Before you exchange your vows," she said gently, "I would like to return something that belongs to you." She unfolded the soft wool scarf I had wrapped around her shoulders on that icy night. The fabric was clean now, neatly pressed, but when she placed it in my hands, I felt the memory of its warmth as though the storm still lingered in the air. "This saved me," she said quietly, "and in many ways, you saved my son too." Tears blurred my vision as I clutched the scarf to my chest. It was not a symbol of wealth or status. It was a reminder of compassion, of choices made when no one is watching, of the unexpected bridges between strangers. The ceremony continued with simple, heartfelt vows that reflected not just our love, but the growth and understanding that had carried us to this moment. As we exchanged rings and the guests applauded, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Kindness had brought us here. Kindness had rewritten everything we thought we knew about fate and family, and standing under the lights with Ethan's hand in mine, I knew with absolute certainty that kindness would guide us forward too. Before we wrap up, I would love to hear your thoughts about everything that happened in this story. Have you ever faced a moment when doing the right thing came at a personal cost, yet you chose kindness anyway? Because those choices, even when they seem small, often shape our lives in ways we never expect. Share your experience in the comments because your stories help create a community built on empathy and connection. If this story touched your heart or made you think differently about the power of compassion, make sure to follow the channel so you never miss another episode. Your support means more than you can imagine, and it allows me to continue bringing you emotional, meaningful stories that remind us of the good still left in the world. Thank you for watching, thank you for caring, and I hope to see you again in the next story.